Dr. Kochavi. It was really an excellent historical background that you gave on this topic. You very well described the beginnings in which Israel was seen as a saver of Jewish heritage and culture, and so that everything had to be brought into the state of Israel. Even my work today, if it's not even, although it's not concerning looted art, but it's concerning, for example, properties, they have in Germany, the Jewish communities have written in their books a claim, let's say that if there will be no Jewish life in Germany, the property will fall to one of the restitution organizations, for example. And so that was also, I think, the idea in the beginning, and then you really describes the shift happening over the Washington Principle, the informal processes, and now the question in like formalizing a process with a law, for example, which really reminds me of many other countries in which the same path happened with an informal process, and now the question about like a more formal framework. So with that, I think we will pass to the question and answer. Please, if you could come up to the stage and have a seat, and let's collect some questions. I think we'll have a microphone ready here. So, go ahead.
Thank you so much for these very interesting presentations. My question goes out to Rachel. I would be interested, is there any kind of the slightest difference when it comes to the different parties in Austria? So, I mean, you know the situation in Germany, the Social Democrats supported the compensation talks. They even saved it in the end, if you look at the ratification process to a certain extent, and nobody should underestimate the role of Jakob Waldmeier. But in this case, if you look at the Austrians, if you look at Figel, if you look at Raab, but also at the Social Democrats, not only the Christian Democrats, not only the Volkspartei or the Christian Social Party, there have been clear anti-Semitic strains, I would say, within the parties. On the one hand, and on the other hand, those people dealing with it, like Raab and Figel, they have been either in the concentration camps or fiercely being persecuted and opposed to the Nazi regime. So what role does that actually play? Is that, I mean, if he's saying we have suffered enough, one would dispute that and would push that away, but I mean, this is, there's, let's say, a little grain, I wouldn't say of truth in it, but of course, out of his personal perspective, and this is the perspective he would have to see, this is not totally to be pushed away. So I would like to ask you, is this like notion, that the fact that they have been under heavy persecution and that they have been like, I mean, if you look at Figel, I think it was 5 years in either Flossenburg, Dachau, and in the end in Mauthausen. So I think this is an example where I would love you to elaborate a little bit more on this, let's say, personal, emotional, whatever side you might call. And the other question goes a little bit to you, drawing a line between the two presentations. Could you elaborate a little bit also on, let's say, the reluctance for a long time on the side of Austria to deal with these restitutions, and also, I think I don't know if you can describe this to be a special case, Austria, but maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit more.
Very good. I think over there.
Thank you. Thank you for a really fascinating panel. And I have a question for three of you. First of all, Kim really congratulate you on this project. I hope it's going to be a bestseller and you'll be able to afford buy a flat in Hamburg because of that. But I also ask myself, would you regard that as history? Because one of the things, and I think we kind of discussed that also over the 3 days, is, you know, history writing is also about maintaining and sustaining the complexity, the ambiguous. And I had the feeling that this type of representation very much, you know, it evaporates. It's not there. It's not there in the same form, just because of the way it's been represented. And you also ended your presentation with a very, very strong statement about kind of echoing very much Christian Proust's kind of concept of the kleine Krieg gegen die Opfer, which is, again, very problematic also for, I assume, for a lot of people who sit here, who actually all the time we now, in many ways, kind of emphasize the ambiguity and the complexity of this process of restitution. And, you know, this type of question also have implication to other process of restitution and reparation who has nothing to do with the Holocaust, yeah? And which also, for instance, bring me to the question as to whether the applicants for the equalization law, would you kind of include them in this kind of type of exercising of violence? Which brings me to the second presentation by Ingo Lose, really kind of fascinating. And I would like to ask you about actually the name, because we talked a lot about Wiedergutmachung. So actually, why did they have, was there any discussion about how to call this type of legislation? And why Wiedergutmachung was not applied to this type of compensation, yeah? And my understanding also of this legislation, that it's a type of a solidarity legislation. So and I know just very little about this history of this legislation, but if I remember correctly, Jewish organization all the time protested against this legislation because it involved paying taxes to fund this type of, to create the fund to compensate these people. And one of the ways to tax these people was to, you know, put extra tax on property that Jews actually were, you know, kind of now kind of were able to reclaim, and now they were actually asked to pay tax to kind of fund other types of compensation. And last but not least, to your presentation, I think it's very much kind of, you invited this question because you talked very much about a very certain type of looted kind of cultural assets. And of course, you know, being in Israel, you have to ask yourself, what about the looted kind of other assets of, you know, the context of the Palestinian looted cultural assets? How all that kind of relate to this complex?
I think we have behind. I think let's go.
Okay. Because this is a conference that is focused on the Luxembourg agreements, I just want to make two short comments in regard to Dr. Kohavi's presentation. The first is that the date in which Israel started to change its views really was the Vilnius International Forum on Holocaust-era cultural assets. In the year 2000, the Israelis were represented by a delegation led by Colette Avital, which insisted that all heirless, unclaimed property should come to Israel. This was something which Stuart Eizenstat, on behalf of the United States and the French representatives, would not stand. And the discussion went until 2 or 3 in the morning. And eventually what emerged was a statement in the Vilnius Declaration that recognizing that, yes, this is the property of the Jewish people, but how it should be handled is a matter which needs to be taken up separately in each case. The second thing is in regard to 2007, I believe it is, when there was this exhibition from France on à qui appartiennent ces peintures, to whom do these paintings belong. The Claims Conference was consulted on that legislation. And my recall of this is that what we said very specifically was that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or another part of the government, needs to certify that indeed the process in the sending country is indeed sufficient for this purpose. In France at the time, you could get compensation, but you could not get restitution. I do not know whether that was actually ever carried out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or others, I think not. And it was therefore just a sort of perfunctory thing saying that, well, we have good relations with France and therefore it's fine. But these are two sort of political aspects of what you're discussing.
I have a comment and a question for Ingo Lose. In your fascinating paper, you raised the question of whether ethnic Germans were given preference to Jewish claimants under the LAG, under the Equalization of Burdens law, and by studying cases from Breslau, you reached the conclusion that no, ethnic Germans were not given preference to Jewish claimants. I studied the cases from Sudetenland. I reached a different conclusion, namely that claimants, ethnic Germans claimants were given preference simply because of the fact that they met the clerks at the compensation offices directly and could convince them of their story. But this is not my point here. My point is that in order to get a full picture of compensation under the Equalization of Burdens law, you just need collaboration between historians. You need good database from the archives, and I'm happy to say that the current head of the Equalization of Burdens archive, the Lastenausgleichsarchiv in Bayreuth, Mr. Kühnel, is very supportive of this kind of research, and he tries to push forward creations of new databases. Now, regarding my question, and here I'm asking you as an expert of Aryanization and persecution in Breslau and in Silesia in general, by studying the files from the Equalization of Burdens law, did you find new knowledge in these files? Do these files provide new information on Aryanization and on the persecution? Do these files add to your knowledge on the years before 1945?
Okay, I have two questions. One is echoing Gideon's first question is for Kim. It's more basic than this. Could you clarify a little bit what kind of book this is? Because is this a mouse and MetaMouse together in a sense of the Luxembourg Agreement or not? Like just to have this a sense of the book really and what is coming. And then for Rachel, you mentioned of course the very important decision of Israel to not be involved, and I couldn't help but think about this 13-volume edition of documents on Israeli-Austrian relations and in general by Steininger. I wanted to ask you more about that aspect of your research, so to what extent will you cover that as well? Thank you.
Hi, I have a few questions. The first one for Kim is, what age group, who is the audience for the book? And is there some kind of teacher's guide, or if it's meant for schools, how does that work? The question that I have for Rachel is, afterwards, the way many Austrian Jews now get a pension is through the Social Security, which is a total legal fiction because it presumes that they paid in for Social Security and they're getting out, which they kind of paid in because they were little children and didn't work. So when did that, who made that legal fiction to be able to give, and what was sort of the background to that? And my last question is for Shira. The Austrian Jewish community, when it thought it would not exist anymore, gave all its community archives to the 1700s to the State of Israel. Then when the community was vibrant, it wanted them back, and the Israeli Supreme Court said, go take a running leap, you're never getting it back. How does that fit into the whole concept of you know, Israel thinks, you know, it's a repository of anything, and when someone wants it back, it does or doesn't give it.
Thanks. I have just two quick background information I wanted to share with everybody. I agree what you said, that in Austria, those measures are rather considered charity than justice. The fact that the claims courts, mainly negotiate and speak to the Ministry of Social Affairs in Austria clearly proves that. So, but we are in a process of also addressing the Ministry of Finance to make that point clear, that from our point of view, we do not fully agree to that fact. One remark you made, I cannot fully subscribe to. You said that the negotiations commenced in '53 and ended in '61. I can assure you and everybody here that from our point of view, those negotiations have not ended yet. They are still in progress. And what my colleague already mentioned, I mean, to me as an Austrian citizen also it struck me always very much the fact that the politician, the second Chancellor Fiegel, a person who has spent years and years in concentration camps alongside Jewish victims, can have made such a comment is more than absurd. So that's really that absolutely illustrates the thinking, the political thinking of that time. And you would probably mention it anyway, but even the coalition partners back then, Social Democratic parties, we know from transcripts of parliamentary discussions that there was a common sense that they wanted to drag on those discussions, drag on things. That was a common understanding between political parties back then. And a short question at the end, because in the beginning you clearly rightly mentioned that from an allied point of view, Austria was the first victim. You referred to the Moscow Declaration. Everybody will be aware there was also a second part of that declaration that reminded Austria of its responsibility and of its own participation, which Austria could not await. That was the quote. And he also said that another reason why restitution was handled differently is that most former Jewish assets were located in Soviet-controlled western part of Austria, as you said. It's true on the one hand, but Vienna, like Berlin, of course, was divided into 4 zones. Nevertheless, the majority of Jewish population lived in areas that were controlled by Soviet forces. But what was the real effect of that fact, that in the 2nd and 20th district in Vienna, most Jewish assets were located, controlled by Soviets? What real effect did that have on those procedures in the end?
Question?
Thank you. I would just like to, my name is Eleanor. I act as an external advisor to an intergovernmental team on provenance research, Holocaust-era provenance research legislation of the Israeli government. And I just want to add the last slide in Shir's presentation. We are at the very, very final stages of a draft of a law that will provide governmental funding for Holocaust-era provenance research in Israeli museums. I hope that we will have a Knesset and then we can move forward our draft as soon as possible, but we're in the complete final stages after having long conversations with the different countries and the different entities and thinking what would suit Israel best, because it's not a simple situation here. First of all, morally, Israel is not a perpetrator. It didn't exist during the war. And also the main issue or the main problem that we have in Israel is that museums are private entities. They're not national museums. They're not owned by the state. And so we have a different type of law that we have to administer. Sorry? It's not owned by the state. No, it's owned by a foundation. It's partly funded by the state, very, very partially funded by the state. It's owned by a foundation. And so that's a very big issue because it's a complete different set of laws that we can administer on provenance research. And but we are happy to announce that it's going to happen very, very soon. And the museums are aware of this and are happy with this. So is, of course, the Ministry of Culture, who is part of the process. So I really hope that Israel can be a good example of provenance research, and that we can bring this chapter to a nice ending.
Final question.
Well, as an Israeli citizen and taxpayer, sometimes you have to be believe in wonders to be a realist. Don't know if you can be a model in Israel. It took 70 years, so I don't know if this is model-wise. But still, coming back to the panel and the question, it was a great panel. Great to hear. After Karen's really important question about teaching material, Kim, with the book by himself, did you compare, I mean, the market now sees more and more, like the one about Anne Frank, which I bought just recently, about the one We Survived, also which came out in Germany and some others. Is there any larger movement of taking those books? I'm reading comics since I'm 4, even today, and I know how they work on children or don't work on children. So is there a bigger movement between you and the others maybe, or within the Institut für Geschichte der Deutschen Juden in Hamburg am Schlump, to develop an approach that those books will be readable for kids in school or wherever they are in the age of TikTok and others? My question to Rachel. Rachel, thank you for the presentation, which I think is important. But right now there's in Austria a big controversy about Simon Wiesenthal's famous statements, which by the way I'm adhere to it, that there were more Austrian procentual participating in the murder than the percentage within the Deutsche Reich. Are you aware of this? And how come you still come to the conclusion, no, there's now a controversy. There were 2 studies coming out, one in Graz by a guy Bauer and also Perz and Radkolb, who are not so friendly to Jews, what I believe, who also support the same claim against Simon Wiesenthal. Are you aware of this, and which material you maybe have found to show that it's different? And to the panel about Breslau and Schlesien, are you also aware that there are materials like, for example, the semi-complete library of the Theologischen Seminar in Breslau, which does not belong to industry, but it's a very important cultural matter, which is sort of rotting in the cellars of the Jewish community of Basel and Zurich, not because they're bad guys, because the communities, the IGB and the Eizenstat, simply have no funds to really take care about it. And the other part who went to Mexico, who is lost, nobody knows where it is. Are you aware of more examples like this coming out of the region you were researching? Thank you very much.
I think we go one by one. Regarding the question, who wants to start? Kim or Shir?
Yeah, I can start. Thank you very much for these very, very important questions. Starting with Gideon. Whether we succeed to bring out complexity and ambiguity, I think is first of all for the reviewers to say. I can assure you that Stephanie Fischer and I try very much, and our decision to use comics as the medium is very much driven by our conviction that it is suitable to bring out complexity and ambiguity. Comics is, and this answers also some of the other questions, is not about simplification. It's not about simplifying history. It's not about, we shouldn't step into the trap of thinking, here we have a medium, it's very accessible, we can attract young readers and achieve that this is easy to consume. It is in itself a medium that requires a lot of pre-knowledge, reading texts and images at the same time. So one of the things that we do, and this answers also Avi's question, is we're very much engaged in a group of historians from memorial sites, but also from research, who reflect on how can we use comics in education. I talk to teachers, I teach history at the university, so my students will be future history teachers in schools. And I always tell them that you have to know what you want to do with comics. Don't just use it because you think it's easy and it saves you time. Once you make the decision for the medium, pay attention to what the potential is, but also what it demands of the readers, and go into that. So yeah, I think we'll see how it will be received. The question about the book itself is very important because it comes out in a series which is called Graphic Histories by OUP. And this is a series that is tailored first and foremost to US American college students. And the idea behind it is to teach history students how we use primary sources and how we construct narrative from primary sources. So it's a four-part book. We have about 80 pages of comics. We then have a second part, which is historical context. This is your classic academic text with footnotes and everything, where we put what you see in the comic in a larger perspective and also reflect about the potential of microhistory and what it can tell us about history on a macro level. The third part is the primary sources themselves. So there will be reproductions for students to read. In this chapter, excerpts from compensation and restitution files, because we want to create transparency and we want to make visible how we use the primary sources for the comics. And the fourth part is the meta level. So there's a making of, which we conduct as an interview with Jay Geller, our colleague, and Deborah Pomerantz, who was our research assistant. So to bring in a conversation of four questions about what motivated us to do this, what is the intersection also of the personal and the scholarly, to make transparent the challenges, the difficulties, and to practice reflexive approaches to history. So very important, I think, is for scholars to constantly reflect what they're doing and how do they make their choices and how do they choose their sources and their topics and their approaches. So this is all part of the making of. So it's a four-part book by the press, tailored in the first instance to US American college students, but hopefully arriving at a larger audience. Yeah, I think that's from my side.
Okay, so to the question about the different Austrian parties, Karl Renner was a socialist. So there were degrees of anti-Semitism. There weren't Philo-Semitism in any of the parties. No one's mentioned yet Kreisky, but Kreisky was not only socialist, he was Jewish, and it didn't make any difference. Fiegel is very strange because you're right, he went through concentration camps, and it made no difference to the way he saw Jews. I mean, he made there are lots of anti-Semitic statements that he made. It made no difference. And to Lorena about Israel and Austrian relations, the Luxembourg Agreement was the exception. The only case where Israel actually got involved in claiming reparations. And the rule was that Israel didn't get involved. Israel had its own foreign policy, which was dictated by the state, the needs of the state, and not by the past. So, I mean, there's no explanation of why Israel took this position, which is very strange in my opinion. But this was sort of the general approach. So, in that sense, it makes in that sense. I don't even if you look, there are no documents which explain it. And everyone knew that it was a fiction, that Austria wasn't not really liberated. Everyone knew it was a fiction. And yet it's very strange, the complete differentiation that people make between Austria and Germany. I mean, Nachum Goldman was very opposed to Jewish DPs staying in Germany after the war. But this didn't apply to Austria. The Austrians made sure the DPs didn't. But Nachum Goldman went on holidays in Austria after the war, so it's not clear to me. Karen, I don't know when it started. I don't think it's really part of compensation. I mean, Germany also had this pension system where you could buy into the system and then get a German pension. I don't really think it was part of Holocaust compensation. But you're right, I have to find out when it started. I know that there was a situation like that. And Marcus, about Vienna. You're right, of course, Vienna was divided into four. The Soviets, though, were by far the most powerful influence. The Americans and the English were very worried about Austria joining the Soviet bloc, and so they didn't want to rock the boat. maybe if the Americans had got to Vienna first, it would have been easier to restore property. But because the Soviets were there, and the only thing that the Americans and English were worried about was that they shouldn't join the Soviet bloc, the Jews lost out. And did I miss someone? No? Aviv? You said about the discussion. I mean, all the, I don't know. I mean, Stephen Bella, all the authorities say that the Austrians killed much more than their relative share in the German population in very high-ranking positions in the Holocaust administration. And I have no reason to doubt that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, which were shorter than well, my answer should be, at least. Well, starting with the equalizations in the framework of Wiedergutmachung, as far as I think in the first place, we should see the equalization of burdens law not in terms of Wiedergutmachung we are discussing here in the last days, but mainly or primarily as a means of integration of post-war German population in the first years of the Federal Republic of Germany. Introducing this law in August 1952 was not primarily designed with Jewish survivors or former Jewish owners of property in mind, but nevertheless as a means of integrating different, groups of post-war population in Western Germany. So this is, of course, maybe the main point. And as Iris mentioned yesterday, Jewish institutions were not involved in introducing and passing the equalization of burdens law. Of course, with the restitution of property was an integral part of the agreement in September 1952. But how to do that, how to bring this into life and practice, of course, was up to the Germans. So, and this is why there was sort of retardation until 1956, when really Jewish claimants were able to take part. But this, of course, you're totally right. This came at a cost. In the literal sense of the word. That looking at the files and looking at at this tremendous duration of the whole proceedings, paying taxes at the very end of the procedure was not the biggest problem. So it's, of course, it's illogical. It's a pity. It's a scandal, no doubt. But for the claimants, and very often after 25, 35 years even, it was normally the children, the heirs in general, who held up the procedures. Paying taxes for the final sum was, at least on the basis of the files I've gone through, the minor problem. That there are different pictures about how the equalization offices dealt with the claimants. This is, of course, very important, and this, of course, cries for demands for comparing approaches to the anti-stuff. The problem is, of course, that the equalization offices were located normally, or most often, in the more or less normal, city administration and so on. So there is hardly any possibility to grasp sort of a complete or coherent picture of the German personnel involved. Of course, there were certain continuations, as in your case with the Sudetengau, but in my case, I didn't get the similar impression. That comparison, of course, means to take into account especially these differences, and it would be highly interesting to encompass additional, of course, say Jewish communities, for instance. Königsberg was mentioned yesterday. Maybe minor or very small Jewish communities in the countryside, for instance, just in order to look whether big cities with big and significant Jewish communities were handled differently from very small communities, something like that. So this should be done, but well, of course, there must be funds for financing that. This is, of course, extremely time-consuming if we are dealing with these masses of files. You are right, the Lastenausgleichsarchiv now in Bayreuth is very supportive, and they started this year a new project in better digitizing and the entire materials, and of course will provide a better approach to the files. But this has not always been the case. I remember when I first got to Bayreuth, or some 20 years ago, say, I was told in Berlin, even by colleagues in the Federal Archives itself, under no circumstances don't mention what you are definitely and precisely working on. So it was something about entrepreneurs and something about shops in Silesia, and that's it. Yeah. So very much has changed in the meantime. So that is important to underline. New picture of Aryanizations. Yes, for sure. And I admit that this was the starting point while working on Jewish businessmen and women in the 30s. This was the starting point to turn towards these files in Bayreuth, because this was not automatically taken into account that these files, could be helpful. So it was just I wouldn't say by coincidence, but something in this direction. So there were the files, and they provided all these descriptions of Verfolgungsgeschichte, how persecution, how the forced selling of property went on, and was organized by the Aryanizations, by the Nazi authorities in the 30s. And so all these descriptions were very helpful in rewriting history, how this entire process in the second half of the 30s precisely went on. So from that point of view, strong yes in that respect. And finally, one more example. Well, Jewish institutions, as for instance, as Jüdisch Theologische Seminar in Breslau, for instance, and something like that, are not part in this sort of legislation. As far as I remember, the very vivid Jewish community now in Wrocław is striving for getting back several parts of former property of the former German Jewish community, but I've no common knowledge on the precise stage they are in the framework of these discussions. I may remind that as far as libraries, for instance, of course, there are still part of Jewish libraries in Polish state libraries, for parts of the Berlin Jewish library is now located in the university library in Poznan, for instance, something like that. So if you are looking for a Jewish newspaper, something like that, and so on, you should go not to Berlin but to Poznan in order to look through the entire holdings they have there. So this is, of course, a multilateral discussion, but not an integral part of the LRG legislation. Thank you.
I'll be brief. I'll be very brief. So I'll begin from the end. Thank you, Elinor, for sharing these great news. And I just want to acknowledge you because I think I can say that I know how hard you personally have been working on this kind of legislation, and I know how important it is to you. So I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I think it's one of the wonderful things about these kinds of conferences that brings a group of experts together, and the kind of exchange that can only take place in these kinds of platforms. So thank you again. Wesley, thank you for your comments. Your knowledge always, it's just, you always have so much to add, and I appreciate it. I almost feel as if I should have shared a few of the slides in advance and asked you a few questions before. So thank you, because it added so much. And Karen, I'm familiar with what you're talking about, the case of the Jewish community, the Vienna Jewish community archives. The archives are divided between 3 places in the world at the moment, between Russia, Israel, and Vienna. And, oh, I'm sorry. So that's right, I forgot, before in Warsaw. And in Israel, there have been efforts to reach all kinds of agreements and resolutions, including digitization. Unfortunately, I don't know the end of that. I know the process. And I'm very short on time, but we can talk about the process in a minute if you want to. So I think with the transition to what Elinor just said, I think there is an effort to change the way that it was perceived and the behavior that existed in the time. And I think now we're moving in a very different direction. And I tried to also mention that in my presentation. I'm hoping that we'll be able to see more of that, but I will continue following that the same as you. Gideon, I'm going to end with your comment because I have probably too much to say about that. So Michael, thank you for your comment. Again, there's a lot to say. One of the issues that I'll just mention about spoliation committees, like the one in Austria, is that it's limiting because it focuses on national museums and national collections, and a lot of the collections and a lot of the art objects exist in private hands. So spoliation committees have a very significant list of limitations in their capacity, and also in how they can achieve restitution and assist in that. They can only assist in the process. In Austria, I would say that although if you look at the research and the history, the restitution laws have been there since 1950s, but they haven't been able to really assist Jews, as we've seen in various aspects. And only recently it developed into the existing spoliation committee, and I think we have to continue seeing how it develops further because it's fairly recent. And I'm sure it will be also inspired by what the Netherlands, for example, is doing. And Gideon, and then everybody can go and have lunch after we speak about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because that is what we are here for. Thank you. It's a very important comment, and we shouldn't ignore it. I agree. From I don't have experience, obviously, working on materials that were confiscated from Palestinian communities in Palestine or in Israel. From my knowledge and my personal experience working with different artifacts and objects, I would say that I might even go broader and look into the work that's been done more recently that have to do with the repatriation and nationalization of lands and materials of even the tribes of Northern America. And there's been a lot of work that is now being done to restitute and to return a lot of objects to the tribe, to the natives. And there's been something that I appreciate since I've been living in that area of the world for a long time. It's called the land acknowledgement that's been taking place in a lot, and it's basically how a lot of conversations begin and a lot of events begin now in places, and I appreciate it very much. I think it's also fascinating historically. A land acknowledgement is basically when you sit in a specific place, you acknowledge the history of the land, who it belonged to and how it basically changed hands. And I think it creates a very, very deep understanding of where you are located in that moment. And also, of course, there's the issue of all the changes around property that have been taking place, and all the research has been done only in the last few years around the 19th century and colonialism. And I think that might be even something to be explored, maybe within that context, how that develops. So, thank you.
So with that, I will thank the whole panel. Thank you very much.